You've mentioned that in your lab at Stanford, you induce stress by putting people into virtual reality and having them go through one of a set of experiences. I think you mentioned this on Rogan or with Whitney that scare them. So, just on a practical, psychological level, and maybe on a philosophical level, what are people afraid of? What are the fears? What are these fear experiences that you find to be effective?
Yeah, so it depends on the person, obviously. And we should probably define fear, right? Because you can,
Yeah,
without going too far down the rabbit hole
yeah,
of defining these things, you can't really have fear without stress, but you could have stress without fear. And you can't really have trauma without fear and stress, but you could have fear and stress without trauma. So, we can start playing the word game. And that actually is one of the motivations for even having a laboratory that studies these things, is that we really need better physiological, neuroscientific, and operational definitions of what these things are. I mean,
yeah.
the field of understanding um, emotions and states, which is mainly what I'm interested in, is very complicated. But we can do away with a lot of complicated debate and say, in our laboratory, what we're looking for to assign it a value of fear is a big inflection in autonomic arousal, so increases in heart rate, increases in breathing, perspiration, pupil dilation, all the hallmark signature features of the stress response.
Mhm.
And in some cases, we have the benefit of getting neurosurgery patients where we've got electrodes in their amygdala and their insula and the orbital frontal cortex down beneath the skull. So these are chronically implanted electrodes. We're getting multi-unit signals. And we can start seeing some central features of meaning within the brain. And what's interesting is that, as trivial as it might seem in listening to it, almost everybody responds to heights and falling from a high virtual place with a very strong stress, if not fear response. And that's because the visual vestibular apparatus, right, the optic flow and how it links to the balanced semicircular canals of the inner ears, all this technical stuff, but really all of that pulls all your physiology, the feeling that your stomach is dropping, the feeling that you're sweating, even though you're not afraid of falling off this virtual platform, but you feel as if you're falling, because of the optic flow. That one is universal. So we've got a dive with great white sharks experience where you actually exit the cage. We went out and did this in the real world and brought back 360 video that's built out pretty.
Oh, so this is actual 360 video.
360
That's
video.
awesome.
And this was important to us, right? So when we decided to set up this platform, a lot of the motivation was that a lot of the studies of these things in laboratories, I don't want to call them lame because I want to be respectful of the people that did this stuff before, but they'd study fear by, showing subjects a picture of a bloody arm,
Right.
or a snake or something like that. And it just, unless you have a snake phobia, it just wasn't creating a real enough experience. So we need to do something where people aren't going to get injured, but where we can tap into the physiology and that thing of presence of people momentarily, not the whole time, but momentarily forgetting they're in a laboratory.
Mm.
And so heights will always do it. And if people want to challenge me on this, I like to point to that movie Free Solo, which was wild because, it's an incredible movie, but I think a lot of its popularity can be explained by a puzzle, which is you knew he was going to live when you walked in the theater. Right. Or you watched it at home. Yeah. You knew before that he survived, and yet it was still scary that people somehow were able to put themselves into that experience or into Alex's experience enough that they were concerned or worried or afraid at some level. So heights always does it. If we get people who have generalized anxiety, these are people who wake up and move through life at a generally higher state of autonomic arousal and anxiety, then we can tip them a little bit more easily with things that don't necessarily get everyone afraid. Things like claustrophobia, public speaking. That's going to vary from person to person. And then if you're afraid of sharks, like my sister, for instance, is afraid of sharks, she won't even come to my laboratory because there's a thing about sharks in it. That's how terrified some people are of these specific stimuli. But heights gets them every time.
Yeah.
And
I'm terrified of heights.
It's when we have you step off a platform, virtual platform, and it's a flat floor in my lab. but you're up there.
Where you actually allow them the possibility in the virtual world to actually take the leap of faith.
Yeah, maybe I should describe a little bit of the experiment. So without giving away too much, in case someone wants to be a subject in one of these experiments, we have them playing a cognitive game. It's a simple lights out kind of game where you're pointing a cursor and turning out lights on a grid, but it gets increasingly complex and it speeds up on them. And there's a failure point for everybody where they just can't make the motor commands fast enough. And then we surprise people essentially by placing them virtually. All of a sudden, they're on a narrow platform between two buildings, and then we encourage them, or we cue them by talking to them through a microphone to continue across that platform to continue the game. And some people they just won't. They actually will get down on the ground and hold on to a virtual beam that doesn't even exist on a flat floor. And so what this really tells us is the power of the brain to enter these virtual states as if they were real. And we really think that anchoring the visual and the vestibular, the balance components of the nervous system, are what bring people into that presence so quickly. There's also the potential, and we haven't done this yet, to bring in 360 sound. So the reason we did 360 video is that when we started all this back in 2016, a lot of the VR was pretty lame, frankly. It was CGI. It just wasn't real enough. But with 360 video, we knew that we could get people into this presence where they think they're in a real experience more quickly. And our friend Michael Muller, who I was introduced to because of the project, I reached out to some friends. Michael Muller is a very famous portrait photographer in Hollywood, but he dives with great white sharks and he leaves the cage. And so we worked with him to build a 360 video apparatus that we could swim under water with, went out to Guadalupe Island, Mexico, and actually got the experience. It was a lot of fun. It was there were some interesting moments out there of danger, but it came back with that video and built that for the sharks. And then we realized we need to do this for everything. We need to do it for heights. We need to do it for public speaking, for claustrophobia. And what's missing still is 360 sound, where 360 sound would be, for instance, if I were to turn around and there was a giant attack dog there, the moment I would turn around and see it, the dog would growl. But if I turned back toward you, then it would be silent. So, and that brings a very real element to one's own behavior, where you don't know what's going to happen if you turn a corner. Whereas if there's a dog growling behind me and I turn around and then I turn back to you and it's still growling, that might seem like more of an impending threat, but and sustained threat, but actually it's when you start linking your own body movements to the experience. So when it's closed loop, where my movements and choices are starting to influence things and they're getting scarier and scarier, that's when you can really drive people's nervous system down these paths of high states of stress and fear. Now, we don't want to traumatize people, obviously, but we also study a number of tools that allow them to calm themselves in these environments. So the short answer is heights.
Yeah. Well, from a psychology and from a neuroscience perspective, this whole construction that you've developed is fascinating. We did this a little bit with autonomous vehicles. So to try to understand the decision-making process of a pedestrian when they cross the road and trying to create an experience of a car, that can run you over. So there's the danger of there. I was so surprised how real that whole world was. And the graphics that we built wasn't ultra realistic or anything, but I was still afraid of being hit by a car. Everybody we tested were really afraid of being hit by that car.
Even though it was all a simulation.
It was all a simulation. It was kind of boxy, actually. I mean, it wasn't like ultra realistic simulation. And it's fascinating.
Looms and heights. So any kind of depth, we're just programmed to not necessarily recoil, but to be cautious about that edge and that depth. And then looms, things coming at us that are getting larger. There are looming sensing neurons even in the retina at a very, very early stage of visual processing. And incidentally, the way Muller and folks learned how to not get eaten by great white sharks when you're swimming outside the cage is as they start lumbering in, you swim toward them. And they get very confused when you loom on them because clearly you're smaller. Clearly they could eat you if they wanted to. But there's something about forward movement toward any creature that creature questions whether or not it would be a good idea to generate forward movement toward you. And so that's actually the survival tool of these cage exit white shark divers.
Are you playing around with, like, one of the critical things for the autonomous vehicle research is you couldn't do 360 video because there's a game theoretic, there's an interactive element that's really necessary. So maybe people realize this, maybe they don't, but 360 video, you obviously, well, it's actually not that obvious to people, but you can't change the reality that you're watching.
That's right.
So, but you find that that's like, is there something fundamental about fear and stress that the interactive element is essential for? Or do you find you can arouse people with just the video?
Great question. It works best to use mixed reality. So we have a snake stimulus. I personally don't like snakes at all. I don't mind spiders. We also have a spider stimulus, but like snakes, I just don't like them. There's something about the slithering and it creates a visceral response for me. Some people not so much, and they have lower levels of stress and fear in there. But one way that we can get them to feel more of that is to use mixed reality, where we have an actual physical bat, and they have to stomp out the snake as opposed to just walk to a little safe corner, which then makes the snake disappear. That tends to be not as stressful as if they have a physical weapon. And so you got people in there, banging on the floor against this thing. And there's something about engaging that makes it more of a threat. Now, I should also mention, we always get the subjective report from the subject of what they experience, because we never want to project our own ideas about what they were feeling. But that's the beauty of working with humans, is you can ask them how they feel.
Exactly.
And humans aren't great at explaining how they feel, but it's a lot easier to understand what they're saying than a mouse or a macaque monkey is saying. So it's the best we can do is language plus these physiological and neurophysiological signals.
Is there something you've learned about yourself, about your deepest fears? Like you said, snakes. Is there something that, like, if I were to torture you, I'm Russian, so, I always kind of think, how can I murder this person that entered the room? But also, how can I torture you to get some information out of you? What would I go with?
It's interesting you should say that. I never considered myself claustrophobic, but because I don't mind small environments provided they're well ventilated. But before COVID, I started going to this Russian banya, and then which I'm curious, and I had never been to a banya. So, the whole experience of really, really hot sauna and what do they call it? The platza. They're hitting you with the leaves and it gets really hot and humid in there. And there were a couple times where I thought, okay, this thing is below ground. It's in a city where there are a lot of earthquakes. Like, if this place crumbled and we were stuck in here, and I'd start getting a little panicky, and I realized, I'm like, I don't like small confined spaces with poor ventilation. So I realized I think I have some claustrophobia, and I wasn't aware of that before. So I put myself into our own claustrophobia stimulus, which involves getting into an elevator and with a bunch of people, virtual people, and the elevator gets stalled. And at first, you're fine. You feel fine. But then as we start modulating the environment, and we actually can control levels of oxygen in the environment if we want to, it is really uncomfortable for me. And I never would have thought, I fly, I'm comfortable in planes, but it is really uncomfortable. And so I think I've unhatched a bit of a claustrophobia.
Yeah, for me as well, probably. That one is pretty bad. The heights, I tried to overcome. So I went to skydiving to try to overcome the fear of heights. Well, that didn't help.
Did you jump out?
Jumped out, but it was fundamentally different experience. And I guess there could be a lot of different flavors of fear of heights, maybe. But the one I have didn't seem to be connected to jumping out of a plane. It's a very different, because like once you accept that you're going to jump, then it's a different thing. I think what I'm afraid of is the moments before it is the scariest part.
Absolutely.
And I don't think that's emphasized in the skydiving experience as much. And also just the acceptance of the fact that it's going to happen. So once you accept that it's going to happen, it's not as scary. It's the fact that it's not supposed to happen, and it might. That's the scary part. I guess I'm not being eloquent in this description, but there's something about skydiving that was actually philosophically liberating. I was like, wow, it was the possibility that you can walk on a surface, and then at a certain point, there's no surface anymore to walk on, and it's all of a sudden the world becomes 3-dimensional, and there's this freedom of floating. That the concept of Earth disappears for a brief few seconds. I don't know.
Wild.
That was wild, but I'm still terrified of heights. So, I mean, one thing I want to ask, just on fear, because it's so fascinating, is have you learned anything about what it takes to overcome fears?
Yes, and that comes from a research study standpoint, two parallel tracks of research. One was done actually in mice, because we have a mouse lab also where we can probe around in different brain areas and try and figure out what interesting brain areas we might want to probe around in humans. And a graduate student in my lab, she's now at Caltech, Lindsay Soleil, published a paper back in 2018 showing that what at first might seem a little bit obvious, but the mechanisms are not, which is that there are really 3 responses to fear. You can pause, you can freeze essentially, you can retreat, you can back up, or you can go forward. And there's a single hub of neurons in the midbrain. It's actually not the midbrain, but it's in the middle of the thalamus, which is a forebrain structure. And depending on which neurons are active there's a much higher probability that a mouse, or it turns out, or a human will advance in the face of fear, or will pause, or will retreat. Now, that just assigns a neural structure to a behavioral phenomenon. But what's interesting is that it turns out that the lowest level of stress or autonomic arousal is actually associated with the pausing and freezing response. Mm-hmm. Then as the threat becomes more impending, and we used visual looms in this case, the retreat response has a slightly higher level of autonomic arousal and stress. So think about playing hide and go seek, and you're trying to stay quiet in a closet that you're hiding. If you're very calm, it's easy to stay quiet and still. As your level of stress goes up, it's harder to maintain that level of quiet and stillness. You see this also in animals that are stalking. A cat will chatter its teeth. That's actually sort of top-down inhibition and trying to restrain behavior. So the freeze response is actually an active response, but it's fairly low stress. And what was interesting to us is that the highest level of autonomic arousal was associated with the forward movement toward the threat. So in your case, jumping out of the plane. However, the forward movement in the face of threat was linked to the activation of what we call collateral, which means just a side connection, literally a wire in the brain that connects to the dopamine circuits for reward. And so when one safely and adaptively, meaning you survive, moves through a threat or toward a threat, it's rewarded as a positive experience. And so the key, it actually maps very well to cognitive behavioral therapy and a lot of the existing treatments for trauma, is that you have to confront the thing that makes you afraid. So otherwise you exist in this very low level of reverberatory circuit activity where the circuits for autonomic arousal are humming, and they're humming more and more and more. And we have to remember that stress and fear and threat were designed to agitate us so that we actually move. So the reason I mention this is I think a lot of times people think that the maximum, stress response or fear response is to freeze and to lock up. Yeah. But that's actually not the maximum stress response. The maximum stress response is to advance, but it's associated with reward. It has positive valence.
Interesting. Yeah.
So there's this kind of, everyone always thinks about the bell shape, the sort of hump shape curve for, at low levels of arousal, performance is low, and as it increases, performance goes higher, and then it drops off as you get really stressed. But there's another bump further out the distribution where you perform very well under very high levels of stress. And so we've been spending a lot of time in humans and in animals exploring what it takes to get people comfortable to go to that place, and also to let them experience how there are heightened states of cognition there. There's changes in time perception that allow you to evaluate your environment at a faster frame rate, essentially. This is the matrix, as a lot of people think of it. Yeah. But we tend to think about fear as all the low-level stuff where things aren't worked out. But there are a lot of different features to the fear response. And so we think about it quantitatively, and we think about it from a circuit perspective in terms of outcomes, and we try and weigh that against the threat. So we never want people to put themselves into unnecessary risk, but that's where the VR is fun, because you can push people hard without risk of physically injuring them.
And that's